Welcome to another episode of Personal Brand Blueprint. I am Dave Polikoff, and today I'm very excited to have a special guest on who's had a really incredible personal branding journey through, writing, authoring books and co-authoring books that led him to be able to grow his personal brand, be able to go and do public speeches and really almost grow out of his kind of 9 to 5 job and is venturing into some new opportunities. So it's really interesting today that we're going to learn his backstory, understand what he did to kind of get to where he is today, and hopefully take some advice and tips to allow us to do the same. So who I have with us today is Brian Piper, who is the Director of Content Strategy and Assessment at the University of Rochester. He is an author, international keynote speaker, consultant, content marketer, AI enthusiast, and a Web3 educator. So Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, Dave. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And there's a couple key things in here. I know AI is a big topic for you right now, and want to start nerding out about that because I'm one who, I will say I've been on podcasts and they ask me about AI, and in the past I've been like, well, here's kind of how I'm using it, but I will admit, as I've gotten more and more into it, I've found way more use cases than I even thought about, and I'm sure there's some that you can talk about today. So we'll definitely get into that. But cool. Let's start with first, before we get into all that fun stuff. Take me back day one. How did you get into content marketing, digital marketing? What's like the day one for you?
Yeah, so I started off as a web developer, making online courses, that sort of thing. Not really something I was passionate about. It was just a job to kind of support my hobbies and my lifestyle. And so, I was working for a company that was, it was a defense contracting company. I was helping build training for military radios, that sort of thing. And then I read Epic Content Marketing from Joe Pulizzi, and reading that and understanding that you could market to people not by trying to push something on them or trying to sell them something, but by just giving them information and helping them solve their problems and answer their questions that they had, and just becoming a trusted resource for them. And then eventually they would come around and see you as someone that they could trust and rely on, and they would reach out to you to use your products or, buy your services. And so as soon as I finished reading that, I went down to our new VP of marketing that had just been hired, and I said, you need to hire me to do digital marketing. This was back in 2014. And we didn't, no one was talking about content marketing back then. So I said digital marketing because she knew what that was. She said, we don't really do digital marketing. I said, well, you should, and I should be the person to help you do that. So she did. She gave me a chance.
Well, let's talk about, so what inspired you to even read that book? Because it's interesting. I interview a lot of people. I know a lot of people who are now in the marketing space, who come from a very technical background. And one thing I say with like people who are very technical, app developers, software developers, et cetera, the way, and I'm from a software background as well, the way our mind works is very technical, and it's very like feature sets and such. And then marketing is more of the opposite side of that. It's the benefits and such. So like what inspired you to venture off into the marketing world?
Yeah. So and that's kind of an interesting wrinkle as well. So I graduated from college with a degree in creative writing and a minor in philosophy. So I was ready to like wait tables forever. And so, luckily my dad owned a business that was doing computer-based training. So in 96, I moved up to New York and started working for him. And he had some really talented developers on his team. I was not one of them. I was kind of learning on the job. I wasn't super passionate about it. And so oftentimes what they would do is, they'd either let me do the very repetitive, monotonous tasks, or they'd put me on the content side of things because I was a writer. So they'd have me help rewrite the content and format it for the web and do, what at the time was web optimization, which has now become SEO. And so I really, started optimizing content for web audiences way back then. And that led me into, when he laid me off, I went and worked for a marketing agency and ran their web and new media department. And that was a great look at, really how to put content out online and market. But I I always felt like a lot of the salesy, pitchy, flashing buttons. And, at the time that was, one of the ways you could get people to click on things. So
Right, the big blinking red button
that's,
with the arrows pointing to it
that's
and all
it.
that. Yeah,
That's it.
yeah.
So, and I started getting into kind of the data and the analytics side of things as well, because I really wanted to see like not only how many people were visiting, but where people were navigating and how they were absorbing the content. So really started thinking about the content journey and the user journey through the website. But, because of my experience, most of my job opportunities landed me in these, roles where I was doing, content creation or course creation, online delivery. And it was a lot of programming, a lot of coding, which I was all right at. I could, hold my own, but working with, really talented creators and programmers, I was doing a lot of the grunt work for them. And so then when I, moved over to the defense contracting company, I was always looking for opportunities to do anything besides program. So the marketing team needed some help with their newsletter and then the way that was getting posted to the website. So I jumped in to help with that, and that led into me helping them, do some video and some script writing. And so I kind of had a relationship with folks on the marketing team already. I do a lot of the image resizing and cutting things out of the backgrounds and stuff like that. So that kind of led me to start thinking about, different ways to integrate myself into content creation at some point. And as soon as I read the first edition of Epic, I was like, this is what I need to do. I need to figure out how to get over into marketing full time. So I leaned into the SEO and my, website understanding and knowledge to work my way into that team. And so within the first year, we doubled the organic traffic to our website. We were able to make some big changes as far as targeting audiences and really focusing on the needs of the users and not really just organizing the website based on, how our organization was set up. And that led into my current position at the University of Rochester. They were looking for someone to help them analyze their data and figure out what content was working and what wasn't. They also happened to be looking at migrating content management systems, and I had just gone through that at my previous company. So that really worked out perfect. Came into this job, I immediately saw a gap in their website optimization. So we were able to make big improvements within our news site. So we were able to double our organic traffic to our news site within 6 months of starting to do search optimization there, and really starting to look at the data a lot more and pay much more attention to what people were reading and what new content we should be creating. And that kind of led into starting to do, once we saw the impact that I had in our department, leadership said, well, you should probably figure out how to spread this message around to other teams across the institution. So I started doing presentations and workshops across the institution to the other schools, to our medical center, our admissions, advancement. And that led into me doing, starting to speak at industry conferences. So, by speaking at different conferences, and actually, one of the first conferences I went to when I started at the university was Content Marketing World, which was Joe Pulizzi's conference that he ran. And I would track him down every year that I went to Content Marketing World and thank him for writing the book and changing my career path. And, so that sort of morphed into eventually after 2 or 3 years of attending Content Marketing World, I started speaking there because I was speaking at all these higher ed conferences. So that
What
led.
what was that transition like? Because public speaking is like people say, I'd rather be the person in the coffin than giving the the eulogy. I know a lot of people start feeling like imposter syndrome and all that stuff. Like obviously you had that credible background leading up to that, but how was the transition from being kind of the behind the desk person to now like I'm this thought leader giving public speeches?
Yeah, and I was, in high school and college, I was big in theater. I come from kind of a big theater family. So I didn't really mind getting up and speaking in front of people. That was kind of, just a performance. But the imposter syndrome was certainly a thing. And I just looked at that as this is a role that I'm playing. So I'm gonna act this part. And, but as the thing about presenting live and, writing books and, all this different content creation processes, you really have to know your material to be able to do that. If you're going to write a book, they say writing a book is like getting a master's degree in that particular area. And to a large degree, public speaking is if you're going to speak about a topic and answer questions about a topic, you have to have a degree of expertise in those areas. And I really started off focusing on, the practical things that I had been doing for the last 15 years when I started speaking that were all focused on, search optimization and those things. So I knew the material very well.
You
I
had the
had
receipts that, hey, this works. I can feel confident in saying, telling people to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And, after the first few times I presented and other people were going out and trying the things that I was recommending and seeing the results, I was like, oh, okay, that's validation for me that, yes, this is working. This is a thing. I do know what I'm talking about. It was a little strange going from higher ed into the content marketing conferences, very different audiences, a lot of larger B2B, B2C companies. It was a little different when I was just speaking to higher ed institutions because not many of them were doing any SEO at the time. But once you got into these brands, a lot of the people in the brands were doing like a lot of SEO and really focusing on it. So that was good. It was good to get out in front of that audience. I learned a lot by talking to those different brands. And it also gave me an opportunity to do a lot of networking with people that I hadn't been connecting with. So I spent a lot more time hanging out with Joe and got to be friends with him. Then in 2022, I was in a Slack channel. We were having a book club, and we were talking about Joe's latest second edition book that he had just come out with, Content Inc. And so I just offhandedly asked him during the discussion, it's like, so when are you going to do a second edition of Epic? Because, what impact that book had on my life. And he kind of offhandedly said, if you want to co-author it with me, I might think about it. And so I kind of laughed at the time. And then as soon as we got off the call, I immediately reached out to him and sent him an email. I was like, if you want to do this, I am all in.
Are you serious about that? Yeah, let's
Right?
let's reconnect on that.
Yeah, yeah, and he said, look, this isn't really something I wanted to do. This isn't really, in alignment with, what I'm focusing on right now. But if you want to take on the majority of the work and do a lot of the research and do a lot of the writing, then, I'll do it with you.
Delegation.
That's
That's a
right.
true entrepreneur.
That's right. And I said,
Yeah.
well, if you'll put your name on it with me, I will absolutely do the work. I had no idea at the time what I was getting myself into.
And you had never written a book before.
Never written a book. I had, written a lot in college, but I was like a poetry focus. So it was much shorter content. Writing a 60,000 word book was a whole new adventure. And then,
Yeah.
co-authoring that with someone else and having to get, his input and feedback. And he did write some of the content that he knew much better. But it was a fantastic process. I learned a ton from him and got to interview some spectacular content marketers. So got connected with them, was able to build and grow my network there. And then really once the book came out, it really changed my, speaking opportunities. I started getting some paid speaking opportunities, which was nice.
Were you using were you actively going out and using the book as, hey, I have this book, this is why I should be a speaker, or were people coming to you because they saw the book and they wanted someone credible like yourself?
Well, yeah, initially I was using the book and content from the book to put in my proposals for speaking. So a lot of the higher ed conferences, a lot of the content marketing conferences will give you a pass to the event if you are a presenter there, but most of them won't pay you unless you're a keynote speaker. But by using the book, I was able to get a lot more speaking gigs. I started doing a lot more guest podcasting, started going on a lot more podcasts, and really helped, start developing my brand. started connecting with a lot more other content marketers, content creators who were out there who had much larger audiences, learned a ton from them, got into a bunch of different communities, got very active in those, and really made a point to intentionally network with people. Like when I would go to a conference, I would pre-stock all the other presenters, and I'd come up with a spreadsheet of who I wanted to meet, what questions I would ask them. I'd put a picture of them in there so I would have that like top of mind, so I could go back and very quickly identify them in the crowd. Um, and just made a point to get out there and find these people who could help me grow my network and grow my brand. And it worked very well.
Well, it's interesting because you were focusing on content marketing. It sounds like more so, correct me if I'm wrong, through the vessel of like companies, businesses, correct?
Correct. And I wasn't really even the one creating the content. I was analyzing the content, optimizing the content, increasing the performance of the content. Once I wrote the book, and Joe really helped get my personal brand focus in line, and then also Mark Schaefer. I read his book Known, and a wealth of information about personal brand. I got involved in his community. I got to be friends with him, and between the two of them, they were like, you got to get a newsletter going. You got to start creating content. You got to figure out a way to build your brand beyond just the speaking in the book. So launched a newsletter about 2.5 years ago. I've been doing that every week. And I think just exercising that muscle of consistently delivering content on a schedule that your users, that your audience can expect and anticipate was a huge thing for me. And then about a year ago, I started a podcast as well, AI for You. So really focused on AI integration in higher ed. And that has just been a fantastic journey as well. So I'm, constantly trying to grow my brand, trying to expand my reach, but also trying to not spread myself too thin. I don't want to, be focused on putting out content on a bunch of different channels. I want to create a few really good, authentic, original pieces of content, and then repurpose and redistribute as technology and time allows.
I think you mentioned a ton of topics there that I want to get into. That was a whole tree branch of things that I want to jump into. But I think the core here is like you you were focused on helping other companies grow their business through content marketing, and then by becoming a thought leader in that space, you then all of a sudden said, "Oh wait," and through your guides that you've brought on along the way, I said, "Oh wait, I'm also a business myself. I need to work on my personal brand." And so you start to kind of apply some of the things that you've learned that's worked for businesses, and then started to apply that to your own brand, which you've mentioned a few already. Let's start with, all right, so you have the book and you started, your main kind of next step was, I'm already kind of doing public speaking for, content marketing world and all that kind of stuff. And so let me start getting out there to kind of promote the book and such. What was those first steps like? What were those first kind of public speaking engagements like? And what was the goal of that? Because when you mentioned I want to grow my personal brand, like what's kind of your purpose behind that? What do you want out of that?
Yeah, and that was one of the things that Joe really helped with a lot, was setting short-term and long-term goals. So, when I was working through the book process with him, he said, his when he started writing books, he set himself a goal that every 18 months, at least, he would come out with another book. So, as soon as you're done with one, you start thinking about the next one and try to get those out on a regular cadence, because not only does that push you to create and to think of, new, kind of big ideas to get out there, or topics that you really want to drill into. But it also helps expand your audience. So that was one of the goals that I set for myself, was to expand beyond just the higher ed and the content creator space. So looking for other conferences, submitting to other different kinds of events, and really getting on all the podcasts. I started getting some paid webinar experiences. So that was great. I started getting some conferences reaching out to me because they had, either seen me present at a conference or, heard about me through word of mouth. I tried doing a lot of work to improve my speaking. Andrew Davis was a huge help on that. He wrote The Referable Speaker. I went and did a workshop with Michael and Amy Port. Excellent, incredible speakers and presenters. So really trying to focus on improving my skills and really thinking like next steps, what's next for me? How can I work towards those goals, and to be really intentional about where I was spending my time. Because that first year I was just, trying to get everywhere, trying to get out in as many places as I could. And then the second year when I was working on my most recent book, really trying to be focused on what is going to get me towards my end goal, what's going to help me, reach the goals that I'm setting for myself.
And are those typically, I mean, we don't have to get too personal, but are those typically financial? Are those like lifestyle? Like, how do you, because I think it's important with our audience when we think about personal branding, a lot of times it's just like, how many sales can I bring in? When you are a solopreneur, and a lot of times it's, you're a business of one, so you don't really have that team around you to kind of keep you in check. We have to keep ourselves in check. So we have to set our own goals. We have to continue to set, et cetera. So how are you thinking about what you wanted to establish for yourself? What were the goalposts that you were trying to create for yourself?
Yeah, and that was, another one of the things that Joe is really focused on is what kind of goals you set, and to make sure that you're not overextending yourself. So basically, what I do is I set, 2, sometimes 3 goals in like 6 different areas. So financial is one, and then professional, family, spiritual, mental and physical, and then philanthropic. So, try to come up with goals to kind of even yourself out, balance yourself out, make sure you've got a work-life balance. The first year that was hard, I came up with 6 professional goals that I wanted to hit. And he's like, no, you got to narrow that down to 2, really focus on those. The other ones you might have time to get to. It's good that you're aware of them. But everything you do, every decision you make, every thing that you pursue, you should make sure that it aligns with those goals. Otherwise, you're not going to be reaching those at the end of the year, because as you start going through a year, how quickly things. I mean, we're already in going to be in February here in a few days, so things go by really quickly. So if you're not intentional with your time, you're going to end up at the end of the year kind of making some progress on some things, whereas what you really want to do is finish a few key things.
Like that. And so you start thinking about your next book. What's that process like? Because I know you also started the newsletter and some other ways to kind of translate what's in your head into content. Are you using other forms of other mediums and channels to help kind of workshop ideas to find what you're going to put into your next book? Like how do you go to market with a book to find and take everything that's in your head and make sure that it's well formatted for a book?
Well, I was lucky that the first book was epic, because as I was working on that book, being in higher ed, I'd be working through the process, working through the content. I'd be like, wow, this is really something that would help institutions, universities. We should be doing this. We have all these stories to tell. Why do I not see more content marketing from universities? You kind of tend to see the same kind of marketing that comes out, and the students on campus under the tree, and all sorts of universities tend to spend a lot of time talking about themselves to themselves and how great they are and what programs they offer, really not answering a lot of the questions that students have, or trying to solve the problems that students are trying to solve. So I was like, content marketing is such a perfect fit. So that's, at the time, as I was finishing up Epic, I said, I need to write an Epic content marketing just for higher ed. So really, as soon as we were done with Epic and got that published, and had done the initial round of promoting that, I got started on the next version. And the great thing about that is I had decided that I wanted to incorporate my intentional networking into the writing of the book. So I started off by reaching out to, other friends and connections that I had in higher ed, some of the people that had hosted the podcast that I had done guest appearances on, and I interviewed them about content marketing. And at the end of each interview, I said, who else should I be talking to? And I ended up getting referred to about 50 different people. So I did 50 interviews to kind of start the writing process and just get my brain going. And I was somewhat intentional about the interviews. I knew certain people I wanted to talk about certain topics. I had kind of already done an outline of the book, so I knew roughly what areas I was going to cover. And so then, it just got to the point where now I just needed to transcribe all of those interviews and go back through them and pull out the key quotes. And then I kind of put the quotes in the chapters where they fit. And then I wrote all the rest of the content around the quotes. And a lot of the chapters were, areas where I had a lot of expertise in those. So I was able to just to write those. So that book was actually, from the writing process, I think it was easier than the first book. But from the organizing process, that was a much more kind of time-consuming, ponderous way to figure out where all these really awesome quotes go, because I didn't want to, leave any of them out because there were so many insights that I got out of those interviews. So very different processes, but really enjoyed both experiences and learned a ton.
And then you start going on to podcasts, and I'm a huge advocate of guest podcasting, especially just everyone's got a podcast these days, but also I find it helps you kind of workshop ideas. It helps you kind of conceptualize your ideas, especially when you get asked questions that you've never been asked before, never thought about before. And sometimes you're put on the spot and you have to kind of figure it out. But it is, it's a way to showcase your credibility, promote your story, promote your unique methods, drive people back to an offer. What was your initial experience like? Because I know you've done public speaking, but for some reason, when people start getting in front of a camera and getting, grilled on certain questions about their industry, it's a whole different experience, right? Public speaking is you're speaking to a crowd, but now someone's speaking back to you in a way. So kind of what was your initial experience with podcasting?
Yeah, so the first podcast I guest appeared on, super nervous. And they had sent the questions that they were going to ask beforehand. But even then, I knew that, just from my answers to those questions, I was not going to fill up the 30-minute block or whatever that they were going to cover. So I was wondering what else, do I need to fill this time? Because when you're giving a presentation, they tell you it's 35 minutes and, you try to get as close to that as you can. You practice for that time. It's easy. You just memorize it. And then I kept telling myself, this is just like answering the questions at the end of a presentation, because a lot of times, you'll have some Q&A at the end. But it went very well. Most podcast hosts will do what they can to make you look good. They're not there to try to, cut you down or embarrass you. And it was just a fascinating experience the first time. And when I got off, I was like, I feel pretty good about that. I want to do more of that. And it's just been, every time I go on and come on another podcast, I learn, now that I'm doing a podcast, I learn different methods and I learn different things that I can do to help make it better, and to help focus myself both as a guest and as an interviewer.
Have you found, of the marketing strategies between public speaking, podcasting, your newsletter, social, which channel and strategies do you find provide, we'll say, the most ROI, or at least towards the goals that you're trying to reach, are helping support those goals the most?
So it's interesting that different channels do different things very well. So if you're looking to grow an audience, a newsletter is a great way to do that. Social posts are a great way to do that. To a degree, presenting is a good way to do that. It's usually smaller audiences though, and like, you're not going to expand your audience beyond the scope of the room unless you're doing a lot of virtual presenting. As far as building trust with an audience, and like growing a community of supporters, of fans. Podcasts are great for that, for bringing people in, for letting people kind of get into your head a little bit more. Newsletters also very good for that. Um, and you know, I think the book is probably the best business card you could ever have. It gives you a sense of credibility to other people, even if they don't read it. I think a lot of people buy books and start reading it and don't finish it. You hear that a lot. I think the best from an ROI perspective, kind of the best thing that I do that turns into work the most often are workshops. So if I go to a conference and I do a workshop there, I will get more people that'll come up to me afterwards and say, we need you to come help guide us through this. I get some of that from presentations, but typically in presentations, you've got time to give a handful of like takeaways, actionable items, which I always try to include in there. And you get those big concept ideas that you can give out to people, especially in keynotes. It's more big ideas and less practical takeaways. But in a workshop, you get to spend, 2 or 3 hours with someone and really showing them the mechanics of how you do the actual work. And a lot of times they'll see, within that time period, they'll start getting the insights and they'll start seeing the value of, oh, this is why we need to look at our data. This is why we need to optimize our content. This is exactly how it's done step by step. And then they go back to their office. They're like, now, how did he do that? And what's the next step? And so then a lot of times that'll turn into actual consulting work.
Which is interesting because, public speaking is a bit of you're speaking at people in a way, right? And workshops feels a bit more of, you're speaking with them. This is like a partnership. I'm demonstrating, but also I want you to be involved a little bit. And I guess you can kind of liken that to content marketing, where like what you publish online should be demonstrative, like mini workshops in a way, if you will, so that it's less about kind of speaking at your audience, and you kind of want this to be like a synergistic relationship, so that people kind of understand the value you can deliver. But then you've only taken them, there's 20 steps in the process, and that 30-second reel is really only showing you step one, and that's when they want to reach out. Is that a way to think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons, like I start off each one of my podcasts with, one short practical use case or prompt that you can use like right now to get you started by integrating AI. So I get a lot of feedback that, people really like that initial kind of hit right off the bat where they're like, oh, that's pretty easy. I can do that. And then you get into the conversation where you dive deeper into, much more complex, much more workflow, kind of long-term issues. But that's exactly, if I was going to pull short form content from my podcast videos, it would be the prompts primarily, and then like key takeaways throughout the presentation, which is what we do.
Well, let's finally get into that meat and potatoes topic, AI. What are some ways that people could be using AI right now? Let's say personal brands could be using AI right now that you find no one is aware of and should be incorporating into their marketing strategy.
So one of my favorite things, and one of the things I talk about all the time, is creating personas. And so you can build, so I like to build custom GPTs within ChatGPT. So if anyone in your audience hasn't built those, super easy to build. You have to have the paid version. But they're basically little mini models that you train to solve specific tasks or to help you with certain workflows. So I've got probably a dozen of these that I use personally, like within my daily life. And then I've probably got 30 or 40 that I use for work, but all sorts of different things. So like my meal planning, I don't do meal planning anymore. My wife and I have 6 kids between the two of us, and I'm the cook and the shopper. And it used to be, a problem. Every Saturday night, I'd ask the kids what they wanted to eat for dinner for the week, and I'd get crickets and no help, no input. And then so I'd have to spend my time figuring out what we're going to eat. So now I've got this custom GPT. I just go in there, brainstorm ideas for like main dishes and side dishes. And then it gives me the specific recipes that I ask for. It gives me images of them. It gives me the whole preparation schedule so I can get as much done on Sunday as I can. And then it gives me a shopping list pulled from all those different recipes in the order that I shop in my grocery store. So, I mean, that alone pays for the $20 a month that I pay for the tool. And then at work, we've got all of these personas that we've created for like potential undergraduate students or board members. And so now we've got all of these, we've trained these models based on data that we have, qualitative and quantitative data that we have about these audiences. We even give it like, here's some LinkedIn accounts and different accounts from different, members of these audience so that you'll get an idea of what their interests are. And then we can ask it questions. We can ask, the personas what they think about our content or what else they would be interested in, what we're missing, a gap analysis. These tools are so good at seeing what's not in the content. And as humans, we're great at seeing what's there, but we're not so good at seeing what's not there. But yeah, I mean, I use these tools for so many different things. I do role playing with the tool. So I'll create a persona and then I'll use the advanced voice feature on ChatGPT. So while I'm driving, I can be virtually bouncing an idea off of my boss and practicing the back and forth and the questions that she'll ask and the answers that I'll give and get her feedback and input on that based on, how I've trained this GPT to act like her and to give me that that response. I know people that are using these for interviews. So if you want to practice for an interview, you just drop your the job description in there. You drop your resume in there, and you're like, what kind of questions are they going to ask me? So
That's interesting. You could probably maybe do the same for podcast interviews then, get some example interviews in there and say, what would be some questions Dave would probably ask me about my topic?
absolutely. I could grab the transcripts from your podcast episodes or just, link out to your different pages and ask it that. I use it for researching people that I'm going to have on my podcast, just to find out more background about them, see what other podcasts they've been on, what other, interviews or presentations they've done. And it just really helps kind of fill out that whole, vision of who that is you're going to be talking to. I use it to help me with planning conferences. So now I don't have to manually go through a conference and figure out who I'm going to stalk. I can actually have ChatGPT go and look at all the different presenters, tell me which sessions are going to be most interesting or valuable to me, who I should be connecting with, what sort of questions I should be asking them. Incredibly helpful.
Yeah. What about when it comes to generative AI and content creation? Where are you in this debate in this world?
Yeah, so I don't use AI to create any of the content that I am going to publish. So everything I write myself. That said, I do use the tools to help brainstorm, to help come up with ideas, to give me different perspectives on things. I'll come up with my outline. I'll load it in the tool. I'll say, what am I missing? What other areas could I include that would be most beneficial for whatever audience that I'm going to be talking to? Then I'll come up with I'll use the tools to do research. I'll use like Perplexity or ChatGPT search because they actually cite the sources. So you're less likely to get hallucinations, or at least you can validate right away whether or not they're legitimate sources or not. And so then I'll come up with a draft, my first draft that I'll write, and then I'll upload it in the tool. I can run it through my brand voice generator. So it'll look at all my previous, podcast transcripts, newsletters, and then it will help adjust the content to make sure that it's in my voice. And then I can, have it look for gaps, look for opportunities, help me punch up the script if I need to, or make sure that it's following the same pattern that all the rest of my newsletters or podcasts follow. And then really on the optimization side of things. So once I put the content out in the world, then I'll grab the data, the performance data, the search data, the online Google Analytics data. I'll upload that and say, what opportunities are there? What other how should I go back and optimize this content? What should I change? And then I'll look at, what gaps are there in this content that I could create new pieces of content that are adjacent but different than this. What questions are people asking that I can answer? It's fantastic at helping you expand your content. And then, like I said earlier, retargeting, redistributing, repurposing content. It's fantastic at that.
Love it. Well, I think that's a good part to put the bow on this conversation. I think we could probably have a whole separate podcast just on AI. So before we sign off, is there one thing you want to make sure you put an exclamation mark on that to tell our audience of the one lesson you want to give them that they take away from this episode?
Yeah, for a personal brand perspective, the more you can network, the more people that you can connect with, and the more you can do to help those people. Like, I'll always look for opportunities to do free things, run audits, help people out, anything that I can do to give my content, give my skills, give my abilities to them without charging them for it, as a way to connect with them and to make them think, oh yeah, when someone asks me about that, I got a guy. I know a guy that I can direct them to. So the biggest progress that I've made in my personal brand has come from networking.
Well, Brian, this has been awesome. Learned so much about your story. And I think kind of the overall theme here is, just keep continuing to add value. And also, don't be afraid to kind of raise your hand and make that connection, because you never know, where that's going to lead. I mean, especially with Joe, that led into just a whole new direction and opportunities for you. So appreciate you coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me, Dave, and appreciate all the content that you put out there.
Thank you so much. I'll see you on the next episode of Personal Brand Blueprint.